Pathological Demand-Avoidance, in brackets PDA, a pathological slash extreme avoidance to its hope by Mr. Richard Woods, London South Bank University PhD student. This is a recording I'm doing of a presentation that I delivered for Echo Autism Ontario on for basically a critical overview of PDA. So yeah, um, I do have some conflicts of interest. I'm not going to linger on them for too long. If you want, you can pause the slides. Oh, I will note that the slides are available online. I put them on. I've uploaded them to my ResearchGate, so I'll put a link to them in the description. They should also go into my LSVU institutional repository once they've been accepted by the person in charge of the repository. So, just back on topic. My perspective, so a bit about me and my kind of biases. So, I am diagnosed as autistic in 2012. I do meet Elizabeth Newton's PDA profile, but I'm not emotionally attached to it. I'm trying to move away from using assessment categories to base my identity on. I think we should be moving towards a transdiagnostic or cross-categorical approach to such matters. Um, my approach to PDA is to equally respect divergent views and evidence to critically synthesize appropriate interpretations on PDA. And I'm doing a PhD investigating PDA as part of the Critical Autism and Disability Studies group at LSBU. This is my interpretation. Literature, others may disagree. This is a bit of an introduction to topics covered in the talk. So there'll be kind of societal and cultural context of PDA and PDA profile of autism in brackets and autism. Kind of ongoing historical debates around PDA. A risk of non-autism figures being attributed with autism. Controversies surrounding PDA, a transactional stress model for PDA, PDA strategies, and the critique of PDA strategies. Um, Quotes are often provided on slides, but these are more there to substantiate points that I'm making. It's a lot more difficult for people to challenge me on the points if the quotes are kind of just provided. So yeah, there are some brief activities which if you want to take part of them, you can just I will kind of just briefly mention them, and you can kind of like pause it and do it in your own time. Um, so this is like your first activity. So basically, this person autistic. There's a list of traits. So yeah. So it's like, do you have like a unique talent, like role play, a preference for stability, like for friends? I'm not going to go through it. Like I think I've provided these elsewhere, but if you want to pause it, if you want access to the slides, they are available. Um, so yeah, I'm moving on to kind of the broader issues of well, just general autism studies. By that I mean like theory, research, and practice. So we know that autistic persons are generally quite well, quite highly poorly treated by society, and that most autism research and practice is poor quality. Poor quality research is often associated with poor quality ethics. We know that there's a theory to research to practice gap, and there's a general lack of good quality autism theories. We also know that pathologizing theories often are poor quality with weak evidence, and their associated interventions often lack efficacy, and there is a lack of inclusive research. Some people are attempting to change that. So this is like an editorial, I think, by Fletcher Watson et al. 2021 for the journal Autism. I do have a bit slightly conflict of interest because I am co-authoring the monotropism questionnaire with Sue Fletcher Watson. But moving on, so this is a recent example that's relevant to my own research. So talking about the monotropism questionnaire, some of you might be familiar with monotropism theory. If not, I'll put a link in the description to a website giving you like overview of it and stuff. But basically, I am co-authoring the development of a questionnaire to assess monotropism theory. The preprint is online, and about 3 or 4 weeks ago, on TikTok, the preprint just went viral as an autism assessment. And if you look at the couple of videos in the screenshot, the top one's got 2.7 million views, and the bottom one's just got just under 600,000. So that's like 3 million views for the Montreal questionnaire as an autism assessment tool, um, and the tool is not designed to do that. So the co-authors have tried to kind of challenge this kind of potential erroneous reification of the MQ as something that it is not. Um, this example was here because I'm trying to point out that it is quite easy for things just to take a life of their own once they're kind of put out there. Um, and it's kind of pertinent towards PDA, so there's a lot of hype around it, and and it's kind of taken a life of its own by itself. So yeah, PDA in the UK. So it's mainly a UK thing, but research to PDA is mainly via people's understanding of autism. It's acknowledged that caregivers are highly motivated to take part in research, um, and that the PDA interest is interest in PDA is substantially outstripped its evidence base over the last decade or so. And due to campaigning efforts, people are likely to be on the lookout for PDA, and it is likely to be a potential source of bias. Um, so we know that PDA is controversial, and we know that um, a few independent parties have recently reviewed its evidence base and concluded there's little to no good quality evidence and have equally respected divergent opinions. And also, PDA has been robustly challenged since 2002, with the earliest examples going to Lorna Wing and Lorna Wing with Judy Gould. Um, so, yeah, I'm moving on to PDA's clinical needs. So, it's generally argued that PDA is needed to explain a person's actions, and it does this better than autism or other accepted kind of categories. And that autistic persons with PDA and their families want it, and their difficulties warrant it. Um, it's also suggested that PDA is needed because it has different strategies compared to autism and other categories. And this is just various points from the literature, including some empirical evidence. So this was no, that's me going off one. So yeah, so it's just basically trying to say that the PDAs will have their own strategies, and that's one of the two main reasons why it's needed. This is a quote from the PDA site on the topic. Just saying what I've just said that basically. Also, yeah. There has been like a supportive community that has formed around PDA Profile of Autism as a diagnosis. So it's also for like caregivers as well. So it's just kind of got a taken life of its own in many respects. I'm moving on to some kind of core controversies for PDA. But this is kind of first kind of the kind of historical context. So these are what I would call the five core PDA five core kind of traits. So these are anxiety-based, restricted and repetitive behaviours and interests. These are kind of non-pathologizing if possible, kind of wording for them. And the suggested figures for if they're universal throughout seen in PDA is taken from Newton et al. 2003. So you got like avoidance of everyday demands, comfortable role-playing pretense, consistent mood swings, impulsivity, frequent intense actions, and social avoidance behaviours. Um, if today, if you're going to come across PDA, it would often be described as a profile of autism, and the justification for this is that autism spectrum has expanded to include PDA features. So the PDA features would exist as a series of continua within the autistic population. Well, within the population attributed with autism. Um, so what these continual lines show is that if it's got a red arrow it's meant to be kind of more problematic, more impaired, while green it's meant to be less of a problem or not a problem. Um, and I kind of clustered it with PDA Profile of Autism at one end and kind of what what is being dubbed in PDA literature as kind of classic or more straightforward autism. Um, but I would kind of question um, that this end probably is mainly just autism, and this end is probably co-occurring difficulties, which is kind of an alternative way of looking at it. So in terms of kind of the features covered in these continua, we've got like anxiety, avoidance of auditory demands, bullying, harassment, lying, stalking, stealing, etc., fantasy and role play, impulsivity, obsessive behaviour focused on other people or characters, kind of a need for control or kind of a drive for autonomy, like rapid mood changes, reinforcement-based approaches like e.g. like ABA, um, or applied behaviour analysis or positive behaviour support, going on to kind of social strategic cognitive avoidance behaviour to kind of like fear of mind. Um, Going into the historical kind of context, if you look at Newton's article, she has her own diagram for what was the pervasive mental disorders diagnostic grouping that was kind of extant like 20 to 30 years ago. Um, I'm going to compare that to the actual accepted version of that diagnostic grouping from the DSM-4, which is I've forgotten it. It's basically the main American diagnostic manual for kind of psychiatry-related categories, from 1994 to 2013. Um, and even superficially, just flicking from one diagram to the other, you should know that there's differences between them, which I'm gonna cover in this table. Um, so on the left-hand side, you have the DSM-4, and on the right-hand side, you have Nielsen et al. 2003. You should see that they contain different categories. So, for example, there's like PDA and a bunch of specific language impairments. For Nielsen et al. And for the DSM-4, you have Rett syndrome, and childhood disintegrated disorder. So this is quite clearly different along, and also what is viewed as autism is different. So, with Nielsen et al., it's only autistic disorder and Asperger's syndrome, while for DSM-4 it's PDD-NOS, which is pervasive mental disorder not otherwise specified. Um, so PD-NOS is viewed as part of autism in the DSM-4. It's not for Nielsen. For Nielsen, it's a residual category for basically the other four categories within it. So um, it's also quite interesting because all these categories within the DSM-4 had to have social communication issues and restricted repetitive behaviours and interests, while for Nielsen, psychiatric disorders didn't. It was not compulsory for them to have restrictive repetitive behaviours and interests because specific language impairments do not have um, any restrictive repetitive behaviours and interests. We also know that autism is based on a triad of impairment at the time, both viewed in Nielsen's and the DSM-4. It's important to note that PDA is not based on the triad of impairment from Newton's conceptualization. We also know that the kind of prevalence rates, the kind of amount of people present captured by these categories and diagnostic groupings, um, is broader in Newton versus the DSM-4 because specific language impairments prevalence rate is 3 to 7% of the population. So there's a bunch of non-autistic people there. And we know that Newton viewed PDA to not be autism as well. She took steps to kind of make it quite difficult to view PDA as being autism. Like she viewed people assigned with PDA to be like non-autistic. Um, so yeah. So this is just a bunch of quotes, which I'm not going to read out, but basically this is Newton consistently saying that PDA is not autism, and that PDA people attributed with PDA should not be viewed as being autistic. Um, and there is quite good reasons, which I've got covered in a different video. Um, so a couple of years ago, I analysed different diagnostic thresholds for PDA to create this diagram. So what this means is more intense frequency, intensity, demand avoidance, higher the diagnostic threshold, the less people of that category will be attributed towards. Um, so yeah, in order to make this diagram, I did a table. So I asked questions such as like, is the demand avoidance pervasive? Is it seen from early infancy? Does a person have to be autistic to get this diagnosis? Are the core five traits present, and are coding issues present? So coding issues is when a person has issues understanding or processing issues relating towards communication. So if you look at the ones that are mainly of interest here would be Eaton Weaver, which is from Helpful Psychology. This study is used to inform the PDA Society's what it claims to be clinical guidance. I view it as a highly biased research report, and Newton et al. So, did it have the demand avoidance to be pervasive? The answer is yes to them. Does it have to be from early infancy? Yes for the Eaton Weaver one, no from Newton. The person has to be autistic or be to be autistic. In Eaton Weaver, yes, no for Newton. Um, um, more recent kind of if you with this research report put out by the PDA Society, they have said that the core five, well, they have core six traits of PDA. So, and you need to have five of these six traits to meet threshold. There's only one optional um, trait which they've got, which is comfortable in role playing pretend. Um, but this threshold is higher than what is seen in Elizabeth Neeson because Neeson gives us percentages of her figures from, I think, in part of her study B, which is like analysing 50 case notes. So, yeah, the very few features were universal throughout her 150 cases, and the two that you're kind of given from this quote is resisting demands obsessively and kind of social manipulative behaviour. So this is obviously a lot less than a threshold that's seen in the being advocated by the PDA Society. So yeah, um, so the reason why this matters is because it means that the present and kind of modern version of well, I don't want to say modern, but the current kind of version being put forward as like PDA Profile of Autism is a much stricter threshold than Newton practiced. Um, and there's other quotes I could give to kind of support that. Um, so yeah, the PDA Society has noted that PDA is diagnosed at quite low diagnostic thresholds in by some people. They have viewed this to be kind of overdiagnosed or kind of non-proper PDA. It's how they would interpret it. I would just call it PDA. Primarily because if a clinician's diagnosing PDA at low diagnostic thresholds, it's because there's a clinical need for them to do that in that situation. Um, yeah, I'd also point out that if you consider the types of behaviours associated with PDA as a category, they're often quite problematic. So they're going to affect a person's life and other people's around them, irrespective if they're like expressed like 1 day a week or like 7 days a week. It's also quite important to note that the threshold for when a feature or behaviour is actually pathologized at is actually quite low. So this is a quote that's taken from the DSM-5, and this quote is in the DSM-5 because it's often quite difficult to work out when a feature becomes pathological at. So variations of this quote are seen in a lot of the diagnostic criteria for the categories in the DSM-5. So in this case, demand avoidance will become pathological when when the disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning, and those are or terms, not and. So that's quite a low threshold when demand avoidance literally becomes pathological demand avoidance. Um, so to this slide and next slide is just quotes showing that there's been consistent debate around if PDA is a form of attachment disorder, going back to like 2007. And I'm just putting this in there to point out that there's good reasons for people to not reify PDA as a form of autism. As in, if they're actually engaging with broader debates, they would not be. They should be a lot more hesitant on what's being said about it. Um, so I'm not going to read these out. You can pause the slide and do it if you want. But the point of this slide is it contains examples from the PDA literature um, of non-autistic people being attributed with a PDA. So the point of this is that PDA is seen in non-autistic persons, and it matters because if PDA is seen in non-autistic persons, it literally can't be autism. So I'm trying to point out there's good reasons to be skeptical of viewing PDA as a version of autism. I'm moving on to quite an important point here because um, from what I can tell, it's plausible, if not probable, that non-autistic features are being reattributed to autism via prematurely reifying PDA as a profile of autism. So this shows a brief diagram from Neeson 1996, page 20. Basically, she's got a frequency, well, percentage of kind of fitting behaviours depending on demands. But a reason I'm asking is because you asked if this feature is caused due to attention or ADHD, mainly inattentive subtype. But so this is like almost 30 years ago. Newson herself was questioning it. More recently, and since Newton's article was published, people have noted that PDA descriptions seem to indicate features indicative of non-autism difficulties, so such as like ADHD, anxiety disorder, oppositional defiant disorder. And people have kind of questioned if PDA is a double hit, so like its features may not be caused by autism. So, for example, Wienertel suggested psychopathic kind of tendencies instead of autism, like causing PDA behaviours. Um, and this is just a quote from NICE, which points out that some topic aspects think that PDA can be its features can be attributed to accepted kind of difficulties or categories like ADHD or oppositional defiant disorder. Um, and that is appropriate to kind of break them down to individual components and kind of treat them. Um, this is a slide which I'm mainly using to point out that this is a quote from NICE, which is basically it's a government quango which is basically in charge of like clinical guidance in the UK. Um, it mentions PDA in one of three autism guidelines, and it's only mentioned in the full guidance for assessing autism in children and young persons. But what it points out is that the avoidance behaviours in PDA can be described as oppositional defiant disorder, and the emphasis is obviously placed by me because it's like mentioned in brackets. So yeah, this is a list of example items from various PDA tools that I have published in a table in a recent book chapter, like from page 70. And these items indicate that PDA's behaviour is done with intent and or manipulative, so it's basically deliberately done a lot of the time. So it's stuff like I blame or target a particular person or persons to say like harass other people, like writing threatening letters, making verbal threats, stalking, and true accusations, sexual abuse. Going through to what strategies aids you use to get out of things. These strategies target a particular person, such as distracting, apologising, making excuses, withdrawing, frantic role-play charm, passively. Does A ever threaten to hurt him or herself, or do things to hurt him or herself? Like, does anyone like? So like, is his behaviour impulsive? Or does A do it on purpose to show he or she is in control, cause distress, or or to get attention? So, um, these kind of, if one just looks at this stuff, it kind of should raise red flags that PDA probably isn't autism. Um, and this slide just contains basically all the behaviours that basically which would be problematic for not only those expressing them but those receiving them from the 11 revised PDA questions from the DISCO. Which the DISCO is an acronym. I forgot what its full name of it is, but basically it's a semi-structured interview used for autism test assessments produced by the National Autistic Society in the UK. Um, and it has similar things such as kind of frequently tease, bully, refuse to take turns, make trouble, kind of tearing from another person's work, putting off someone's spectacles. And this goes back to a point around if these are expressed like 1 or 2 days a week, but compared to like every day a week, these are going to cause problems, going to affect people's lives, and it will be pathological at a lower threshold. It does not have to be pervasive to be pathological to be to count as a form of disorder. Um, there is some empirical evidence to suggest that um, a bunch of PDA features are not related towards autism. This is not all of it. This is just some examples indicating that PDA is a pseudo syndrome. So there's a triple hit of autism, conduct problems, and assumed anxiety. Another study which is based in clinical practice indicates that PDA features are predicted by anxiety, conduct problems, and hyperactivity. Um, this one is a snowball sampling one done with caregiver rating measures. It's just a lot of the demand avoidance, especially non-compliance, is predicted by executive functioning issues. Um, this is another study suggesting collected as part of the same time as this one, but with a different thesis. Um, is that theory of mind was not found to relate to PDA traits in autism, implying that there was at least partially distinct mechanisms underlying PDA behaviours compared to kind of actual autism traits. So this this thesis, assuming that PDA is a form of autism, which I have issues with, but yeah, it seems to kind of suggest that what Wing was suggesting, that PDA features may not be caused by autism, might be onto something. This is a study based in adults, again, snowball sampling, like I'm talking about, you're going to tell 2020. It's just that PDA features are predicted by attention issues, antagonism, and kind of lower emotional instability. Lower emotional stability. This study also found that that autism did not strongly predict PDA. And this is a study that's done with children over like a 12-month time period, so checking up for long-term outcomes. It suggested that basically PDA was not predictive of adaptive behaviour, and they suggested their results are in agreement with authors of questionability of PDA as a distinct thing. Um, I have often pointed out that if PDA contains features which are more than autism, it cannot be autism because like basic logic tells you A plus B does not equal A. So it's but yeah. So one of the most replicated results from empirical studies on PDA is that PDA behaviours tend to decrease as a person ages. Um, it's believed to be due to people developing better coping mechanisms than the PDA behaviours. Um, and this is what this quote basically says. It's kind of important because the amount of people not meeting thresholds, especially this like children, young persons not meeting threshold as they become adults, is substantially higher than seen in autism. For autism, it's only around like 9 to 10% of people diagnosed with autism as children no longer meet clinical threshold for an autism diagnosis, and that's substantially lower than what's been indicated by PDA studies at this moment in time. Um, this has some indications such as obvious one like PDA is not autism, but also equations of PDA is developmentally stable or is in fact pervasive at all. Um, so yeah, just a moment. So this diagram views PDA as being a collection of features that are attributed to kind of accepted difficulties or categories such as anxiety, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, or conduct disorder, trauma, or developmental trauma. So where these kind of intersect, that's where you kind of get PDA. And this kind of builds on this notion that PDA is plausibly a bunch a series of non-autism features that are being reattributed with autism. So yeah, it kind of this matters because we know that most people who are attributed with kind of these psychiatric categories, they'll tend to have multiple categories if they're assigned with one. And these categories will often interact with each other unpredictably, and this can affect feature presentation, such as some features can be made more intense or more severe, and other features can be made less severe. And I am mentioning severe in quotation marks. Um, it also can lead to some new novel features being presented, and this means that you can get novel kind of categories being formed from other categories interacting. And this kind of matters because we know that co-occurring difficulty is often said differently in autistic people compared to non-autistic people. It means that PDA may be a result of anxiety, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, or trauma interacting together to produce PDA, and it can be any combination of those or other kind of categories. This has implications in terms of that PDA, if it is a distinct thing, should present differently in non-autistic people compared to autistic people. That means that you cannot, if you're basing PDA descriptions on autistic samples or assuming PDA is a form of autism, that is unlikely to be representative of PDA in non-autistic people, which means you cannot use those descriptions to say how PDA presents in non-autistic people or not. And this is just a diagram showing the points on about how any of these categories can interact in any particular combination to potentially produce PDA. Um, so yeah. Um, so moving on, there's also been consistent kind of doubts around PDA causing confusion both in kind of clinical and research settings. So Anna Giraldi predicted that PDA will create confusion for caregivers and others involved. That includes clinicians. And Green et al. 2018A, so there's strong recognition factor. So that's like the light bulb moment that people often talk about with PDA. That is subject to a range of however, be subject to a range of expectation and confirmation biases. So yeah, so what it means is that um, the it's saying it maybe it, it's possible that what's being seen with it, maybe people are kind of reattributing things which they shouldn't be reattributing. They also point out in their defense in the defense article that PDA being viewed as a form of autism is a risk to clinical language validity, and it turns nosology upside down and is a recipe for clinical and research confusion. And it kind of goes into broad critique. It's kind of been found out in Godard's systematic reviews, such as a general failure to account for alternative explanations for PDA, and that sourcing participants from places knowledgeable in PDA profile autism is a risk of bias. And I will make this point that, from what I can tell, the reason why alternative explanations are generally not being considered is because those people researching PDA as a form of autism, they seem to just be assuming that PDA is autism and that alternative explanations for PDA are automatically mistaken or invalid. Um, so if you got that as an axiom, why would you consider alternative explanations? Why would you consider alternative explanations such as non-autism features explaining PDA? Um, so yeah, I would point out there's a clear risk that non-autism features could be confused with autism due to PDA profile of autism, and I point out this possibility should already be actively considered. The simple reason for that is because researchers have an ethical, well, the standard expectation of them is to be critical, to question the underlying assumptions. Um, so yeah, it's just about engaging with other people's views and respecting other people's views and being humble. So we also know from attempts to divide autism that basically it seems impossible to successfully divide it. Like, all attempts have failed, and it's why I would argue that non-autism features have been used to try and create profound autism. So profound autism is another proposed autism subgroup, subtype, and it's constructed using co-occurring intellectual disability and/or language issues. Um, this means is, if profound autism is using non co-occurring difficulties um, to create it as a subtype, it would indicate that PDA is using non-autism features, i.e., co-occurring difficulties, to create a subtype. Um, we also know that the autism subtypes from DSM-4, which were autistic disorder, Asperger's syndrome, and pervasive mental disorder, not otherwise specified, they were replaced with autism and social communication disorder within the DSM-5. Um, I also know from talking to someone who was one on the committee that designed the DSM-5 autism criteria that PDA was informally considered and excluded from the DSM-5. So it's also important to note that due to autism category being kind of amalgamated into one, it's not designed to create autism subtypes. Like, I'm referring to DSM-5's one, and this point is made in a Stephen Cap article. So, like 2023, it's a really good article. I encourage everyone to kind of read it. Um, what this means is that the autism criteria are not designed to make subtypes or to let alone be used to diagnose PDA. So what that indicates is that each kind of PDA profile of autism, um, identification seems to be a misuse of the DSM-5 autism criteria. Um, so yeah, we know that PDA descriptions have changed away from nuisance to indicate that they are autism. What I mean by this is that the PDA literature has been quite clear that many features of PDA are problematic being viewed as being autism features. And if you analyse the wording for these traits over time, you can see the non-autism aspects been changed to become autism like. So, for example, the manipulative behaviours are not indicative of autism. However, over time, they have changed from strategies of avoidance are essentially socially manipulative to strategies of avoidance that are essentially socially manipulative with social manipulative in kind of quotation marks to uses strategies a part of uses social strategies as part of avoidance, such as um, distracting, giving excuses. So you can see that the manipulative aspect, i.e., the non-autism aspect, has been kind of changed to become strategic. Um, and that literally means it's become autism-like. There is a problem with this, and I'm using this example particularly of the socially strategic versus socially manipulative. Um, and these are a couple of quotes from Fidler and Chris 2019. Um, basically, um, so I'm going to read out the first. So this combined with sufficient social understanding and sociability enable the child to be socially manipulative in their avoidance. They put that in the social avoidance in quotation marks, but the next point is actually really quite interesting because they also say they're also able to use social strategies and attempts to avoid demands in a way that Elizabeth Newton describes as being social manipulative. The social manipulative is in brackets, but she's also said that others tend to describe it as being socially strategic. Um, so what they're saying is that the social strategic behaviours are equivalent to socially manipulative ones. But I would refer you back to um, the Bishop 2018 paper, which suggests that PDA strategies are not related to theory of mind. We know that Newton viewed PDA as having basically intact theory of mind, because its social communication issues were attributed to um, deficits in pride, social identity, or shame, according to Newton. Um, if you go back to those kind of clinical examples I showed you earlier from, the items from the various tools and PDA I showed earlier that denote intent or manipulative, that actually it does seem that PDA has intact theory of mind. So I would conclude that social manipulative equals socially strategic. Um, so it does seem in this situation that kind of non-autism individuals are being confused with autism in this case. So yeah, I'm moving on to controversies. So yeah, so PDA has quite a few. So such as associating criminal acts with autism. Most autistic persons tend to not want autism divided into subtypes. Interest is mainly driven by non-autistic stakeholders, and we know that like attributing someone with PDA can potentially have an adverse effect on their lives. So, for example, who would wish to employ someone who has a pathological or extreme aversion to demands, primarily requests from other people? I previously mentioned how I think it was in Kent, special schools were refusing to give some children diagnosed with PDA basically school placements because of it. We also know PDA's clinical needs have been severely contested for 2 decades. I mean, I personally do not think PDA is clinically needed, but I recognise that some people do, and there are some studies to potentially indicate that. Um, but kind of moving on, so there's like a consensus over what PDA is or how to assess for it. Um, Also, if you consider the PDA stereotypes, are actually quite opposite the autism ones, so such as like making eye contact, like is sociable, like wants friends, etc. These are directly opposite a lot of autism stereotypes, so it makes it quite difficult for autism people to kind of escape the stigma from having a dual kind of autism and PDA diagnosis. You also know that kind of interest in PDA outstrips evidence-based and is culture-based to the UK. As I've said, point out previously, that this should not be the case. Like people should be much more restrained in what they're saying about PDA, be much more cautious about it. Um, so it's also highly circular. There's a premature kind of community practice around it. I'd point out it's unethical and unscientific to conduct research which only favours one outlook over another. Because like research is not conducted just to support one outlook. Most research is conducted to falsify hypotheses. So, for example, in order to kind of scientifically claim PDA as a profile autism, one would need to systematically investigate and falsify PDA's competing hypotheses and only have like PDA profile of autism be the only intact hypothesis left. There also seems to be a lack of disclosure of conflicts of interest. And also there's a lack of cogent accounts of PDA in terms to rectify nonsensical logic. So, as I pointed out earlier, like PDA cannot be something it's more than. So just saying that autism is expanded to include all these non-autism features is, well, it's just a bit silly. And the next one is kind of more Newson, as part of her social communication issues trait. She said that she included panic attacks, but these panic attacks are meant to be due to deficits in social identity, pride, or shame. So like, but obviously they don't cause panic attacks. So um, yeah, I mean, yeah, well, so just moving on. So oh, I'll mention that bit. There also appears to be a market for PDA Profile of Autism, so that's kind of reflecting my first PDA, well, my first article generally. And we know that some people do seem to be kind of financially benefiting from it. I mean, for example, from Phil Christie's meant to be the leading expert on PDA. From understanding, he's been in private practice since 2014, specialising in PDA as a version of autism. Um, yeah, I mean, would he really be in private practice for up to 10 years if he was not financially benefiting from it? So yeah. Um, so what happens to yeah, so there's many vulnerable people who have brought into PDA as a form of autism kind of narrative, and I'm pretty confident that there is this hyperactive will burst. So, kind of what happens to these vulnerable people who have bought into PDA as a version of autism? So, I don't have time to go into this in full detail, but I have a lot of concerns around PDA, profile of autism, and profound autism, especially if they become accepted as proposed autism subgroups. Um, So I have a entire video from that, which, if I remember, I will stick in the description. So, um, yeah. Um, so I'm moving on to kind of the next section, which is kind of transactional stress-based model of PDA. So these are example items from the 11 revised PDA Disco questions, the extreme demand-avoidance questionnaire, which is observer rated for children and young persons. Um, and the extreme demand avoidance questionnaire in adults, which is a self-report item for adults. So, so you got like seems as if he or she is distracted from within, knows what to do, what to say to upset specific people, lacks awareness of one's own identity, are driven to be in need to be in charge. Um, so the next set indicate they basically show well, it helps indicate that PDA, a lot of the behaviours attributes of PDA are just generic behaviours that people use to assert their self-agency, especially when distressed or stressed. So I complain about being illness or physical incapacity to avoid a request or demand, attempts to negotiate better terms with adults, or apparently mixed behaviour. I point out that if these features were seen in non-autistic people, they would be seen as virtues, um, especially in kind of like neoliberal Western culture. So um, just moving on to kind of stress and PDA. So stress is viewed as something that's transactional in the environment. So a person becomes stressed when the stressor exceeds our resources of our kind of coping mechanisms. So a person finds the situation taxing. So in order to kind of reduce some of the stress levels, you often aim to improve a person's coping mechanisms to have more resources. So basically, the stressor does not exceed their the coping mechanisms. Research indicates that two-thirds of stress behaviour is triggered by demands or questions by other people. And that the bottom bit is a quote from the DSM-5, so it's literally a category C from the DSM-5 autism criteria. So this quote says that autism basically has to present from early infancy, and there's two exclusion terms, but one of them is literally transactional stress one. So it says that symptoms must be present in the early development, the mental period, but may not become fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacities or may be masked by learned strategies in later life. Um, so yeah, what I'm trying to point out here is that demand avoidance is intrinsically viewed as transactional with the environment, either the person's internal or external environment. Oh, I meant to mention that bit. So like problem behaviours such as non-compliance and defiance, and even so, these behaviours can be viewed as part of kind of avoidance behaviours of demands. So these can be like non-compliance, defiance, leaving an area, stereotypy, kind of self-injury behaviour or aggression, um, We know that these can be triggered by everyday demands, so such as a child young person finding a situation aversive, some uncertainty around it, or kind of transitioning from a preferred task to a less preferred task. Um, so we also know these distress behaviours associated with kind of PDA exist within a series of continua within the human population. And I've got some examples to kind of show that. So this is a diagram which I have some issues with, but it can be quite useful from the PDA Society. So it kind of shows you types of avoidance behaviours, um, and they kind of escalate in kind of I don't like in kind of difficulty for people to express, but also kind of be received on the end of, from basically everything about how other people's experience of receiving them is. So you got kind of like using distractions, excuses, procrastination to kind of physical incapacitation, withdrawal, fantasy, um, reducing conversation to meaninglessness, like taking control, complete compliance, kind of full on kind of like agitation, self harm, threats of self harm, running away, like causing destruction, and people can kind of skip through these kind of levels quite quickly, or it can escalate quite quickly, um, which is what this says. Um, so Liz and Nyons did some empirical work, and she proposed that demand avoidance behaviours in PDA are developed to maintain through a generic negative reinforcement cycle. So you have the cue, you have the activity, and you get the reinforcement. You have the demand, duty, escape, avoidance, and then you get kind of reduced anxiety, and you get like temporary relief from that, and it kind of goes back around. So um, I proposed the demand management cycle, which is kind of informed by the OCD cycle, but it builds on the Irons work. So um, this is from Woodson 2022 from page 64. So got demand would be internal and external, and you have anxiety under stress, that triggers some kind of form of avoidance behavior, either irrational and or irrational, um, and you get some relief, and then you get some temporary relief from that anxiety to stress, and due to that relief, you get a negative reinforcement. So yeah, people can cycle through this until the actual avoidance behavior triggers has that demand removed. And it matters because basically the avoidance behavior is this stuff here. Um, so it's kind of like using distractions as it work. You might end up going full on up here. So like often if you're being violent towards someone or causing those destruction, that will cause someone to remove the demand on you. It basically interrupts the interaction that's happening. Um, so this is a three-dimensional model of PDA that I tend to use. I apologize, I've got a slightly old one. I've revised this axis to, as I mentioned earlier, I view manipulative and strategic to be equivalent. So what I've got here is the more stressed a person is, so the more highly aroused they are, the um, the more things are done with intent. So the more manipulative, strategic they are, the more highly aroused, the more stressed they are, the more the social avoidance behaviours are going to be compulsive in nature. The tendency of distress behaviours featured. That's literally just these behaviours. So obviously, if you're kind of using distraction stuff, that's be like close towards the zero axis. The more kind of you do not acts of violence, kind of physically running away, etc. That'll be kind of the further down here axis. So because obviously, well, they just set that zero. And this one's literally just how often they express the demand avoidance features. Just so that could be over a day, a week, a month, hour if you wanted to. And again, I'm using this threshold from the DSM-5 for when demand avoidance becomes pathological. So, pathological demand avoidance begins when the disturbance causes clinically significant distress and/or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. And this is just a Willemsen model. So, you can see how these behaviours will kind of will affect the quality and quantity of social interactions the person receives, and that can affect their kind of skills to develop or maintain. That can obviously cause anxiety, stress, and kind of feed it all back into. So all these areas interact to construct and or maintain kind of PDA as a neurodivergent way of being human. Um, so yeah, this is just an example. So I'm not going to play the video, but it's like 2 to 3 minutes long, and it's of a female investor talking about her lingerie business, and she talks about how she's trying to grow it, and she gives some examples of when she's pitching it to some male investors. These male investors become uncomfortable listening to this woman talk about kind of women's bodies, body shapes changing, and talk about lingerie. So these male investors will do stuff like fidgeting, making excuses, like asking questions, to kind of to get the topic to be changed. Um, and this is that kind of low level avoidance behaviours to demands being expressed. So you can literally map this out onto the demand management cycle. So you can put your demand down and get the anxiety and stress being shown by the demand investors, put out the avoidance behaviours, and you can see them get some temporary relief from it. Um, so this is another example. So this is reporting from clinical assessments done from Eaton and Weaver. So these are some assessments from health psychology. Before I go into it, I need to point out. Well, actually, I'll mention give the example and I kind of point out their perspective next. Um, so basically, this is reporting clinical assessments of children and young persons, and they'll use as part of these, they'll use a bunch of tests, and what some of these will be the some of these will include the ADOS, which is the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, and this is basically controlled kind of simulated social interactions to try and get kind of to produce scores to indicate if a person's maybe autistic or not. Um, so this is basically placing a lot of demands onto these children and persons being assessed. Um, and these children have expressed various avoidance behaviours as a result of that, such as using inventive or elaborate excuses, um, taking on various kind of other avoidance behaviours. They've done some quite extreme stuff, so like knocking objects over, like throwing tables over, removing themselves with the assessment materials from the room. They've like rarely threatened the clinicians with physical violence. Usually after every attempt, so you can kind of see these children working through the various types of avoidance behaviours, kind of working up to the more extreme stuff. Um, so yeah, I kind of need to point out that the clinicians doing these assessments are quite skilled and generally quite good at autism assessments. They would get uncomfortable using this as an example, um, but I think it's relevant. I would also back it up because we got there's another study that used the ADOS with children and persons suspected of having PDA. And this is 2013, like chapter 8. Um, and she reported some stuff. She said that some children can complete the ADOS, express quite difficult behaviours for her to kind of, or the or assessor to kind of administer the ADOS on. Um, so it just seems to be a fair example to use system and management cycle on. Um, I'm trying to point out that like the clinicians that administer this test that they report in the article they did multiple different ways to kind of reduce demands and trying to adapt the assessment process to kind of interrupt the child and to gain useful data for their assessment report. So yeah, so so you can use the management cycle to work out what kind of demands are being placed on these children, what the anxiety stress behaviours are putting on them, and at what points they're kind of getting some temporary relief from those demands being removed, and therefore the distress anxiety being removed. Um, so moving on to the final kind of section, so this is kind of PDA strategies and critique of them. So this is a standard kind of question I ask around PDA strategy. So, but the first thing to get you to ask, like piece cognition strategies, like what you think are kind of good practice, or such as allowing someone time to process information. Um, you can pause this. I'm going to do this in your own time. But the point of this is I'm going to get you to compare your list to the PDA strategies. Um, so I'm going to read out. So these are a list of PDA strategies from the Autism Education Trust in 2019. So this is such as specific key work and trust relationship, being flexible and adaptable, indirect praise, letting things go, negotiating by providing choices to pupils, having positive relations, thinking out loud, tone of voice, treating anger as communication, using humour, use role playing obviously various materials like visual communication methods. Another version of this is the Panda graphic from the PDA Society. Um, so they would have kind of minimizing rules, enable some choice, control, explain some reasons, accept that some things can't be done, trying to humour, distraction, obviously role play, be flexible, always have a plan B, and have plenty of time. word decision requests indirectly, constantly monitor tolerance for demands and match demands accordingly. Doing things together helps, like keeping calm, being proactive, collaborate, negotiate to solve challenges, fairness and trust, reduce uncertainty, recognize and underlying anxiety, think ahead, treat meltdowns. Like, some people are arguing that PDA is kind of compulsive, which I think some aspects of it are. But I'm trying to point out that if you're negotiating to resolve stuff, um, or to solve challenges, then that would suggest that something's done by choice. Um, but moving on, so if you compare your list to either set of PDA strategies, you should see there's a great deal of overlap, and you should see that basically PDA strategies replicate just generic good practice. Um, so if you're familiar with kind of low arousal approach from Studio 3, you'd see that the PDA strategy is can be used as a version of the low arousal approach per se. It's a bit more in detail than that if you're doing a Studio 3 version of it. But that's a tangent. So yeah, I'm just going over kind of this side covers the arguments for PDA having its own distinct strategy. So, like reinforcement-based approaches are ineffective for PDA. Like similar mechanisms of demand avoidance are seen outside of autism. Um, it's argued that kind of common caregiving interventions, which use reinforcement-based approaches, and it suggests that PDA is needed to kind of protect children attribute PDA from these reinforcement-based approaches. I'd point out that if similar cause mechanisms to demand avoidance are seen outside of autism, then PDA should also be used to help protect these non-autistic people from reinforcement-based approaches. But that's just my view. Um, More generally, this is a response to 2019 UK government proposal to have a more strict authoritarian based kind of school management system. And this is from the British Psychological Society. It talks about how having simplistic and reactive approaches are stressful to teachers and do not adequately teach children why their behaviour should change. Um, it's kind of pertinent with children who are known for often experience social problems such as autistic people or children that have been attributed with PDA. Um, there's an important quote which I'll put on that: warm, supportive relationships with adults, a sense of belonging, high expectations, teaching social and emotional skills, and autonomy are the key ingredients to positive behaviour change for children and young people. So this kind of goes back to kind of a strong overlap with the PDA strategies. I'd also point out that strategies and interventions often tend to be issues or symptom specific. So, for example, um, social stories is meant to help autistic children learn kind of theory of mind or social skills for interacting with others. Social stories are often used with children with attachment and or trauma issues, um, or looked after children as well. So yeah, so this is an important quote from Stephen Catt from his wonderful 2023 article. So, a substantial proportion of the risk of poor outcomes is likely to be socially produced, and the course of an autistic individual's development is determined by other factors as much as the condition itself, including the enrichment and modification of social environment. Social context also affects autistic people's functioning, such as benefits from parental acceptance of autism inclusive educational settings. So, what this means is that presentation that an autistic person's attribute of PDA will have is likely to be adverse as much as affective by factors that are not intrinsic to the individual. And this matters because it kind of counteracts this kind of narrative that PDA must be an automatic intrinsic thing, and we're taking a rather essentialist approach to it. Um, and this is another quote from this wonderful article by Stephen Catt that it says that, for example, bidirectional effects exist between autistic people's externalized behaviours and parental distress um, or criticism, but they appear more driven by parents' impacts on their children. So, what this means is that often these PDA behaviours they're likely to be caused by how caregivers are interacting with the child, and that by using the PDA strategies, they are likely to get a direct drop-off rate um, from the amount of kind of external avoidance being presented. So, and this is kind of this can be predicted. Um, so yeah, it's been noted that kind of the autism interventions equivalent to PDA strategies have been practice independent of the PDA category for years. Um, Recently, a small-scale qualitative study has come out saying that teachers already use strategies or resources which might be effective with PDA. And I point out that, as I mentioned earlier, that if you're familiar with the arousal approaches advocated for by Studio 3, that the PDA strategies are just a personalised version of that. But in order to do the low arousal approach properly, you have to personalise your way you interact with someone independent of what categories are assigned with. Um, so yeah, more recently, like generally, there was a report in the UK around positive behaviour support that it should only be used with intellectual disability and not autism. Um, and why that matters is because it's not only those activated with PDA that should be protected from reinforcement-based approaches. Um, if one accepts his outlook that reinforcement-based approaches like positive behaviour support or applied behavioural analysis should be used with those with intellectual disability, it means it can be used with those attributed with profound autism. Other critiques in literature is that there's no evidence of differential treatments between autism subtypes, which is one of the reasons why the autism subtypes were removed from DSM-5. And autism have noted that traditional autism interventions are often ineffective, and by traditional autism interventions, they tend to be things like applied behavioural analysis. Kind of more worryingly, a recent kind of I think it was a meta-analysis. Basically, this article shows that earlier autism interventions have little to no good quality evidence suggesting they're effective. So generally, that other autism strategies or interventions that well, there's evidence suggests that they work. So the point of this is that it helps to explain that why some people might have a lot of hype around PDA and are requesting using PDA diagnosis to access these good quality strategies because the general other approaches to autism are just ineffective and generally don't work. And this one's kind of important is that with the autistic population general distress, we know there's just a high amount of suicide attempts and successful suicide attempts, and there's a bunch of other indicators as well, but that's a problem one. Yeah, if the autistic population well-being was not overall so precarious and so low, um, well, basically, if autism interventions were or approaches generally were quite good, then the the autistic population's well-being would not be so bad at the moment. Because of there's clear ethical problems with trying to link good practice strategies to a particular subgroup of autistic persons, and it matters because with the general distress of the autistic population, if you're having trying to tie a certain set of good quality strategies to a particularly narrow group, that risks depriving those good quality strategies from the broader autistic population, which is in general need of just better support. So what that means is you're more likely to. It's predictable that if you have PDA as a profile of autism, it risks denying other autistic people good quality strategies, which will likely trigger more suicide attempts and therefore more autistic deaths. Um, and the final one is quite important because PDA strategies, irrespective if they're used for autistic people or not, they need randomized control trials to indicate their effectiveness and to be included in high-level reviews such as Cochrane reviews. Um, so, yeah, I'm going to be concluding now. So there's significant hype around PDA as a profile of autism. PDA has significant controversy and ongoing historical debates. Claims surrounding PDA profiles also need to be critically evaluated and contextualised in broader discourses. It is at least plausible that non-autism features are confusingly reattributed with autism via PDA profile of autism. PDA strategies replicate good practice, and that it's plausible that PDA profile of autism is a result of factors other than those intrinsic to the person, such as autism. Yeah, like we should be following typical ethical standards, and I mean like generic ethical standards, not those ethical standards associated with autism because they're typically quite poor. Um, but yeah, and we need to prioritise integrity of accepted categories like autism over PDA profile of autism. Um, and it matters because if the hypothesis that non-autism features are being mistakenly attributed with autism due to PDA profile autism is valid, you're undermining the integrity of of autism journeys generally, but also autism research, because you just don't know what you just don't know what features are being included in your populations. Um, Essentially, yeah. So that's it. So there's my email address, like Twitter handle, ResearchGate, link, a link to the channel, which hopefully you're watching this talk on. Um, you can pause to the side if you want to access it. I'm onto the references. I'm not going to linger long on each slide because you should be able to pause it and access them. I will have a link in the description to the sides for ease of access anyway. Um, so yeah, that's pretty much it. I think there's around about 12 reference sites. Please don't quote me on that. Um, so yeah, um, this was this talk. I know it's quite long, but it was quite involved, and I was asked. Um, so yeah. So thank you for your time, and I hope you have enjoyed it overall, and I hope you kind of watch this video and other future ones. And yeah, that's actually it. I can stop waffling now. Anyway, thank you. Bye.